Welcome to GovCon Unscripted, where we dive into the unfiltered stories and strategies from all around the world of government contracting. Join host Chelsea Meggett as she explores how to navigate, thrive, and win in this complex but lucrative industry.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to GovCon Unscripted. I'm your host, Chelsea Meggett, CEO of Collaborative Compositions, and today I've got with us a guest, JL Hancock, President of Xiphos Innovation, author, and consultant. JL, who are you and what do you do?
Hi, great to be here. Yeah, JL Hancock. I am an author and consultant, former 20-year military veteran as a cryptologist, and I worked as part of the Naval Special Warfare community as something called a tactical information operations operator. I guess the easiest way to describe it is if you ever watched a movie and there was some guy in front of the platoon holding a computer telling him which way to go, that would be me. So that was the job that I filled there. And the last 6 years of that time I spent working as the head of the Future Concepts and Innovation Directorate, where I managed a portfolio of about 40 different RDT projects and helped put the first AI drone in combat. Currently, I work as an author and a consultant based on the information that I gained while I was in the military, but also helping businesses and company work with the defense ecosystem.
Wow, that's a lot. You've got a ton of history and a ton of fantastic experience that I'm sure folks are going to find both interesting and really valuable for a lot of lessons learned today. So I'm really excited to get into this. So tell me a little bit about your time working with the SEALs, working within RDT&E on the Pentagon side. What was your experience like? How was it? How hard was it to get money? You mentioned earlier on that you got some other people's money. What did that look like?
So the earlier part of my career, I was embedded in the platoons, helping them conduct what we called precision geolocation operations, where my job was to literally tell them which house to hit. As time went by, though, we started focusing a lot more of our efforts on unmanned systems. And in 2016, I was brought over as what was then called the M39X. It was an experimental extension of signals intelligence operations. And I was building payloads for Scan Eagles, which are a type of pneumatically launched fixed wing small UAS. And there was a payload capacity that you could put on that bird that allowed you to do a lot of different types of missions. At that time, there was a lot of miniaturization taking place. And when it came to certain technologies, especially in the realm of software-defined radios, so we started putting those on there, but at the exact same time, quadcopters and small drones became more the norm. Surprisingly, we found that our community wasn't ready to start ingesting the capabilities of that particular type of platform, and nobody really owned it. So we just said to ourselves, if no one owns it, they can't tell us no, let's start playing with it. And so we started building drones on our own. We conducted these things called limited objective experiments. And every 2 months, we would go out to a particular facility. And for a couple weeks at a time, we would just conduct R&D on our own. We built drones. We built a lot of payloads. We built a lot of different types of sensors. And when I say we built, there were some engineers there, but there was a stipulation that you couldn't be in our office unless you were personally turning wrenches. So everybody had to do the work. Everyone had to learn how the systems operated. And through that, we ended up creating something called the N9 Future Concepts Innovation Directorate that was originally started by Admiral Szymanski at Naval Special Warfare Command, he at the time was the admiral. And the job for us for a 6-month period, probationary, he said, all right, help me determine the value is of having an organization like yourselves that is different from the acquisitions N8 side of the house. And SOCOM used to have something like this. I believe it was called the J7. And their job was to conduct a long-term campaign of learning and to develop future concepts and technologies. It was disbanded in 2015 and more or less consolidated into the J8. But there still was value, we felt, in having a group that wasn't necessarily married to the traditional acquisitions pipeline. So if anybody is familiar with JSIDs and what SOCOM called soft SIDs, it really is a reactive process that waits until a gap is identified or an event occurs that drives a new capability need. What we were doing is anticipating everyone's blind side as it pertained to emerging technologies. At the time, it was in quadcopters. We immediately okay, these can be weaponized very easily. They can be turned into SIGINT payload capabilities. They can be A lot of different options there. So we were slapping those on and then trying them out and deving out different tactics, techniques, and procedures. But in the process of that, what we learned is because we were not acquisitions and because we weren't working off of existing requirements, then we needed to find a way to build out these concepts without making anyone upset, because the acquisition side was very angry about us trying to step into their lane, thinking we were going to take any of their money, which we didn't want any of their money. It would have nice if it didn't use it because we felt we could have been more effective with it, but that was not our lane. So we had to play with semantics. We couldn't call something a prototype. We had to call it a model. We couldn't say that we were developing a capability. We had to say it was a concept. And that led us to ultimately working with a lot of organizations that needed to push forward different scientific capabilities, but didn't understand where they lived. And so instead of saying, here's a gap and a need, here's where the technology goes, what we did is we just went on this long-term campaign of learning. I went and visited as many national laboratories as I possibly could, and I would sit down in the lab and I'd say, okay, hit me with every project you may have that you think I might be interested in. And so for 30 minutes at a time, these engineers would pop in for 2 or 3 days and just overload me with whatever information they felt was that I needed to know. Basically, it was just them pitching everything they could find at me. And then things would be, if I found something interesting, then I would write it down and I would keep that in the back burner. And then I'd go on to the next. And then I'd go to a trade show. And then I would go to other commands and figure out what research they were doing. And then we started really molding our concept around that. And what eventually we landed on was our job was to watch our admirals blindside. When it came to emerging technology and things that the N8 couldn't do at the time, our job was just to learn about that and to inform the 8 as to what was going on, as well as inform and create ways of articulating information back to our senior leadership of how to transition it. So we had to know what the technology was, research existing requirements did or did not exist. And then from there, we needed to say, okay, who might want to fund this right now? So got really good at spending a lot of time in the DC area, finding people that wanted to pay for stuff that wouldn't lead to a congressional mark against our organization because we were taking money that had already been allocated by Congress. So, for example, if you go to DTRA or the Office of Naval Research, or at the time JIDO, those organizations had their own funding. So if they choose to fund a project, as long as it's not an already funded project being paid for by different RDT&E dollars, you're fine and you wouldn't get a mark. We were also having to play with and learn about how OTAs worked. We were heavily working with transactional agreements, getting what now is called a 4021 or 4022 or 4023, getting really adept at those, played around with 8As. Everything that we could find that could allow us to manipulate contracts in a more effective way, as well as find resources. So we never showed up to the table with anybody having not fully researched what we wanted to do, not knowing how to contract it, not knowing how to fund it, not knowing what subject matter expert we were going to assign to it to babysit it to make sure that it had the appropriate spiral development. And then we didn't do any of that without having an appropriate transition process. And even if that transition was just, I'm going to inform people of what we learned. So that was the bulk of what we did during that time.
That's a whole lot there. So let's just break this down just a little bit. I love what you went with language and having to go from model to prototype and capability to concept. In today's world, and specifically within the realm of OTs, in 2016 is when they popped back up. They started to become a little bit more popular. They became a bigger thing. And compared to now, they're pretty common language. I think folks are getting pretty familiar with what other transactions are, what other transaction authority is, how it can be leveraged to do novel development of prototypes and develop out concepts and do some prototype production. So how was it working with OTs? Did you have to inform people that what an OT was, what ultimately you could do with them, and how you could leverage that specific type of vehicle, which is very much a more flexible vehicle than FAR-based contracts, to do some of that development? And who taught you about OTs?
So first of all, OTs were and have been a part of the acquisition process for decades, right?
Oh, sure. They've been around since the 50s.
Forever. NASA wouldn't exist without OTs.
Right.
And so a lot of people don't understand that. So initially when we were starting to do it through what was then called DIUX, because it was...
Okay. Yep.
And
that's the entity that you went through was DIUX.
Initially. Okay. That was one of them. We were looking at other organizations like NSTXL and other consortiums that would allow you to do OTs. But the resistance that I got was I was repeatedly told I was going to go to jail.
What?
By my own organization, because they didn't understand it. They just
Okay.
And so the default state is if you're not doing FAR, then you're going to go to prison.
Far, all fear.
It was something that I had a hard time wrapping my brain around because, and I don't want to disparage the community too much, but I will say this. I've never seen such brave people cower until they have administrivia and policy thrown in their face. And when they don't understand those particular things, they tend to default to a state of you can't do that. And MTAs, so mid-tier authority, was coming out in 2016, and I was super excited about that because this just allows us to leverage this in a much more effective way. No interest at all from my own organization. No interest in OTAs. And
Really?
Eventually I ended up doing is open kimono here. I actually made sure that I put the money that was received from an organization with a national lab or another neutral party. And I operated as not as the sponsor, because once again, these are loaded terms.
Very loaded.
I was the technical SME.
Okay.
And what was nice about that is, let's say, for example, before the OTAs became really big and CBERs changed under the AFWorks model, Spark Collider events, the only way for me to do something close to a sole source down select was to push money to a national lab. The nice thing about using a national lab is they could do their own down select, and they could move really fast about down selecting the particular companies they wanted to work with. The other thing that was nice about it is the lab was managing the money directly on behalf of whatever government organization I was working with. So let's say DITRA funded a particular offer at Sandia National Labs. I was the body that said I had concepts and devved it out. It was how we wanted to do it, but it was a DITRA project, top to bottom. And then at the end of the day, if my particular organization didn't want it, there was no harm, no foul, because they didn't pay for it. They had no skin in the game, and they weren't having to pony anything up at the end of it. But what I would do then is, let's say I presented it and was like, hey, this is all ready to go. Do you guys want it? And they said, no. I would hand it off to a different branch of service and then write a report on what that other service is doing to use that, and then hand it back to my own command to create FOMO. And then they would get angry that the fact that they didn't have it because the other branch got it. So if the Marine Corps had it, MARSOC or whoever else got this before our guys did, they got super upset. And I said, instead of rubbing it in their face, I just said, man, it'd be really nice to get hold of that, something like that. Yeah, it would be cool. Let's do it. I'm like, okay, let's do it. And then I had to check my ego at the door because it would be very easy for me to submarine things because my ego was getting in the way. But we put the first AI drone in combat because we made people think it was their idea when we'd been running it the entire time. And that was effectively the only way to make it work. Because if you're fighting ego, then it's going to stop every element of development.
Fighting bureaucracy is one thing, but fighting egos is an entirely different ballgame. Absolutely.
Right.
So tell me a little bit more about your work with labs. So I've worked with several labs, I've worked with national labs, and I've worked throughout that ecosystem. Lots and lots of technologies developed there. So were you leveraging a combination of government developed technologies and commercially developed technologies and finding the best of both worlds, pairing them together, and then developing and ultimately the concept from that?
Yeah, so there was a couple ways that we would do that, and it depended upon what the topic was. Department of Energy labs, Department of Defense labs, UARCs, FFRDCs, all of these fun acronyms that we create associated with that. There are centers of excellence across the country, and these different places have different niche capabilities that really need to find the light of day. Unfortunately, you spend half your time just chewing through junk.
And a lot of labs. Just
Yeah,
a lot of those labs are run by like some of the bigger companies too. So there's some large company involvement in some of these labs that are not necessarily run by, but heavily participated in by some of the larger companies.
Or the lab itself runs like a company, and the ROI is being involved in projects, not actually producing results.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So did you notice that?
Yeah, I fired labs just as often as I fired private companies. Just because they're a lab doesn't mean they're good.
True.
I'm going to be blunt. That's just the reality. And there's two types. And here's another thing that we ran into that I would throw out a lot. I always push the need for the Christensen model of modularity and the avoidance of interdependence and reliance on interoperability. But I said GOTS is a form of vendor lock. Forcing people onto a government-only software or hardware solution is another way of crippling the government. Here's one example. I can badmouth this organization because they don't exist anymore. So I was funded by JIDO to develop an AI drone. And at the time, it was the Shield AI Nova, which eventually they don't produce the Nova anymore, but the Nova was and will always be the first AI drone ever put in combat. It was an incredible small quadcopter. It's just when Shield did the assessment of from a value proposition of comparing the VBAT versus the Nova, which one is actually going to bring in more money, the answer was the VBAT all day long. But the Nova was a significantly more impactful capability on the battlefield, in my opinion. And it's very sad that they couldn't get the funding to keep it going. But if there's no money to buy these AI quadcopters, then so be it. However, getting back to the main point, Jaido really wanted me to force Shield AI to use ROS, Robot Operating System, is the standard academics-based means of operating and running robots. So it's like ArduPilot using their own software, but ROS was a military variant of that. Anytime you have a military or a government variant that is derived from academia that is comparable to what is on the market, it tends to be a degraded version of that by about 2 or 3 years. So they were saying to me, hey, Jim, could you force them on a ROS? And that way we have a government-owned operating system. I said, why would I take this advanced company and handicap them by 3 years to meet your requirement when the technology doesn't even exist yet? Makes no sense, and I'm not going to do it. They didn't care for that statement, but I didn't really care. And in the end, it was the better decision. And I'm seeing it again and again right now where fighting some projects right now that are funded through congressional marks, and Congress has said you will appropriate it based on these needs. And it's a waste. It's frustrating because it is a waste. It's a waste because it's a degraded version of the capability. But this happens a lot in between government and vendors. And they're always just trying to find an answer. And you'll never really know until you get to the end state, but you can see all the marks. The problem is the people that make the decisions associated with that funding goes are not the intelligent ones. They are either a bureaucrat who doesn't understand technology and is emotionally attached to whatever person is funding them, and they're going to keep or kill a program based upon who's greasing their palms, or just to put it bluntly, or the cooler heads prevail because these other capabilities fail in actual operational deployment.
Now, that brings to mind a great question for me. So I've always been under the impression, and I've always interpreted that delay or that lag in development on the government side as a fail-safe, a protection mechanism for the entity against things that may not have been tested out all the way. That might be the beta version. It might be the newest, the greatest, but nobody's seen it actually function or integrate with other systems. So they want to make sure that what they're putting in isn't necessarily just the first, latest, and greatest, because that may fail. That may have some bugs, some issues that go into it. Is that not what you found?
I think that's a separate conversation. What you're talking about is what comes under the terms of operational testing and actual deployment of the system. I'm talking about lower TRL development.
Okay.
So when you're going from your TRL 2.3, where you're saying it's a concept, and then you're moving into an actual hard prototype of the system. When you're in those middle TRLs, that's when the real sausage making is done. And that's where a lot of the bureaucracy takes place within the labs, because they're fighting to take their hypothesis and make it something that is viable. And there is a good place for national labs. And I don't want to knock on labs. I love the engineers that I work with in those competent places. Notice I said competent. So there are places where those centers of excellence that I found, if you were to say, okay, what labs do you think just absolutely crush it day in and day out? I would say probably like Sandia and Oak Ridge National Labs. They knock it out of the park every time you hand them something. A lot of times MIT Lincoln Labs, they're not perfect, but they do great stuff too. And then other than that, it's like there are just individuals at labs. I'm like, that person's amazing. I hate the lab. And I'm just being blunt because it doesn't hurt me at all. I don't care. I'm not in the government anymore.
Welcome to Hot Takes.
There you go. And that's the reality of the situation. And what you'll end up seeing is certain names pop up a lot in certain projects because that individual, whoever's managing, that is the person that has the ear of the appropriate person at the Pentagon. And it sounds good to say, I'm going to hand it over to this group. And I'm not going to call out the names of certain major projects, but there are certain huge projects that are being run by certain labs right now that I think should just be completely shuttered. They are a massive waste, but they won't be shut because they are appropriately funded by people with the right relationships.
And they probably have been for some time.
Absolutely. And it has nothing to do with whatever the government's doing now. They're going to continue. That's not me being pessimistic. That's just me watching this over 20 plus years. And that's the way things work. You can't take a non-technical individual who doesn't understand how these programs work and have them make a decision relative to the input of information that's been filtered. That's how you blow an O-ring. That's the system. That's bureaucracy right there.
So there's no
So
real good spot for that education. And in some cases, there's folks that aren't even really willing to learn.
here's the thing. When you're developing an ecosystem based upon humanity, everything is personality driven.
Right,
So
right.
you're trying to find the right personality and the right advocate to drive the capability or drive the concept forward in a way that allows you to have the impact that it needs to in the time that needs to. If you look at history and you look at the way that some of our most impactful moments have taken place, it was because of the right person was there. The best example from a historical standpoint is when the original founders of what eventually became MIT Lincoln Labs created radar in the late 1920s, and they presented it to the Army, and the Army literally told them engineers have no place in fighting wars. And it wasn't until 1941 that those same engineers went up to the president and said, we have this thing called radar. It allows you to detect objects from a great distance, also coordinate things. And the president turned to the head of the Secretary of the Army and he said, why don't we have this already? And he said, I don't know. And it had been presented to them time and time again. And then literally within 30 days of implementation, boat activity off the coast of the East Coast decreased by 95%. But it took nearly 15 years.
First of all, a really long timeline. And then not one that most companies in the commercial realm can live by. That's not something that a commercial company can go out and develop and say, hey, we've got this fantastic brand new age tool. Yeah, implement it, have them say no, and wait 15 years. That's just not a timeline.
The weapon they do have nowadays, though, is venture capital. That's changed the game. And that's why you've seen companies like Anduril and Palantir and Shield and now most recently Saronic just completely explode because they're able to get on the market with a product faster. So here's another element of that conversation nowadays. Also, the Department of Defense will base everything off of a gap, right? As I mentioned, we had previous conversations, soft
very
SIDS
reactive.
JSIDS. Yep. So the JSIDS process is reactive in nature, and it's designed that way because McNamara, when he created it, he wanted it to have a governor built in so that it wouldn't move faster than Soviet development. They didn't want that. But we still have those governors in place, even post 2000, when the computer chip has completely changed private industry. Before then, the national labs were the driving force for all of our major national developments, IBM, all those things. Those are all done by government grants and funded by the government. But after 2000, that all changed. So now we're moving at the speed of private industry, and venture capital can allow those things to move faster. But what I ended up seeing is I was consulting for one company, and I was actually asked to be a founder of another that was their competitor. And I turned it down because of just from a personal ethics standpoint. If I'm consulting for one company, I'm not going to jump ship to their competitor and just start building another company. Some people ask me if I kick myself because that company is worth several $billion now. But at the same time, I don't care because I was going to stand by my ethics on that. But the fortunate thing is I was telling the other company what they needed to be doing. And what they were being told by the government was, for example, one thing that is used a lot with unmanned systems, especially larger ones, we just want a truck. We want something that'll carry stuff, and then you let us swap out the sensors. But when you got robotic systems nowadays, they're driven more by their behaviors than the other elements of their hardware. And I spent a lot of time developing this when I was both active and now, is that when you have a robotic system that doesn't have a base behavior that it can conduct or a mission that it can conduct on its own, it's effectively useless. But the thing is, these senior officers were telling these companies, we want a truck. So when they showed up with a truck and then the other company showed up with a sensor-driven capability that operates based on a behavior, they were like, man, why didn't you build that? And they would say, I built exactly what you asked me to build. But the requirements then would start shifting towards what that other company would build. And that's what my old office used to do, is we would go chase out the company that was making the new stuff, or we would actually build the new stuff and then present it back as a concept. And we used to work through SOCOM S&T. We funded these videos that you can actually watch. One, a good example is called AI for Maritime Maneuver. You can watch one of the videos we made. And that the concept in that one video alone was pitched back to the commanding general of SOCOM, and it became the #1 priority at the time and was valued at nearly $800 million. And that came from the office that we did because we were building out concepts from the things that we'd learned from these other companies. This was several years back when this particular down select happened, and a lot of things shifted. Money shifted, priority shifted, administration shifted. So it's not the case anymore. So I'm not speaking of anything overly sensitive. However, when you look at how things go, the narrative that changed, and I listen to the way that people are articulating things in the office. You say, hey, Jim, how much have things changed really since 2016 when you're developing
Right.
these capabilities? Sadly, a lot of the stuff that I was deving back then still hasn't come to light.
Really?
Yeah.
But back then, I don't really recall people using the term dual use. Is that something that you had heard back then? Is that a concept that you had riffed on?
Yeah, we use that term all the time because you got to remember Silicon Valley wasn't amped about putting VC capital into defense firms at the time.
Right.
So you had to have dual use technology. You had to have something that could be used for commercial and for government. So when we would talk to companies, it was hard. For Shield AI, for example, they were not dual use. They were completely all in on supporting Department of Defense. But they ended up getting Homebrew, A16Z. Like they had these other major investors funding them eventually. But if you follow Ryan Sang on LinkedIn, he'll even talk about how they were on a wing and a prayer trying to get these things going. And we ended up being one of their first government contracts through the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental. The other reason why we knew about it is because one of the original creators and founders of DIUX was a SEAL admiral. And Hendrickson was the one that basically got our connections through NSW into that organization. So that's how our knowledge of OTAs began. And CBERS became a much bigger deal 2019 when AFWERX came online. And I was very excited about that because I didn't need to use the national labs anymore. Then what I would do is I would find an Air Force counterpart and I would say, hey, I like this technology. Will you co-sponsor it? And it wasn't a big letter sponsor. It was just support. But they were on the hook because they were the Air Force organizations. It was an AFWERX CBER. So I got the value of it. And the thing I really wanted out of it is I needed legal justification for allowing those individuals to show up to my experimentation events. People couldn't just show up because you can't just invite onesie-twosie companies to show up to an event that aren't on contract because that's giving them inappropriate access to the government that they don't legally have. They don't have a CRADA. But if I got them on a CBER, they could show up all day long, right? Sometimes I would meet certain companies because they were invited by somebody else. So be it. If a separate company invites them, then it was fine. But the CBER thing allowed me to have as many companies as I wanted to the experimentation events. And I could dev concepts right there on the fly. And one example would be like Skydio's original R1 before they came out with the Skydio 2, and then before they came out with the current iterations of their different drones that they have. I was working with another company called Python, which allows you to do gesture controls. And I had the two companies there and I said, hey, could you guys control that quadcopter with your gesture control? And they were like, yeah, let's try it. And then 30 minutes later, we were flying a drone off of gestures. But the reason why I wanted them to use the Skydio drone and not a regular drone is because the Skydio drone had built-in SLAM that allowed it to avoid running into things, and you could build in behaviors. They were already on the system. So your gestures were basically allowing it to initiate a behavior, not to initiate movement. So you're going from fine to gross motor function, and that was a massive shift. And we did it in 30 minutes. We didn't need a CBER. We didn't need all these different things. However, the CBER allowed me to put these two people in the same room. And then that ended up turning into different proposals and different. That was literally what our office did is we started these events and we would just make weird stuff up. We literally built a tethered drone in our trailer that eventually was supposed to transition to a program of record, but it didn't quite make it. But it was a big deal. We made it. We presented it to the Secretary of the Navy at the time and did a lot of great stuff in that.
That's really interesting. I love the blend of CBER and lab technologies. Were you picking from CBERs before then? Were you looking to bring SBIR companies in? That program's been around just as long.
Yeah, we were using traditional CBERs through like Office of Naval Research. We were using some of their CBERs. We were also doing things that people with CBERs didn't really realize you could do. Let's say, for example, you have a NASA CBER. You can transfer custody of that CBER over to a different branch of the government.
Sure. Absolutely.
And a lot of people didn't realize that. The other thing was we were playing with how to reprogram funds. So people don't realize that if it's one color of money, it doesn't have to stay that color forever, especially if you're using a consortium like NSDXL.
Right.
We didn't reprogram funds I don't know if we ever successfully did any of them because people had a lot of O&M money, but they never had RDT&E.
Sure.
And so RDT&E was the golden goose. You always wanted that because it allows you to do literally anything you wanted. Like you could buy equipment, you could pay for hours, you could all these things. But then you could use those to your advantage in a way that allowed you to leverage funding and colors of money that you had. But we just became really good at a lot of that stuff and a lot of understanding where the money came from and why it was allocated and the timelines associated with those allocations. We did one where we eventually became a pretty big program where we didn't have any money start off, but we were like, this will be a big program the money will come, but we have to have a contracting vehicle because people won't put anything on there unless there's a contract.
Right.
So I said, let's start the contract. Let's pedal together a couple bits of cash. And we did that with this thing called AI for Small Unit Maneuver, which became a pretty big DIU program that allows multiple different drones to be coordinated from one interface. So right now, I think they got up to 20 drones that you can control off of the handset on deck attached to your chest. Right now, they've eventually put into a Tomahawk controller. But what's unique is that's not just a bunch of drones flying. Each drone has its own mission.
Right.
And they're doing different things and making their own decisions. And then you just basically as a mission commander are dictating what each one of those missions are. But we started that program back in, was it 2020? And the coolest thing we accomplished is we had a Shield AI Nova that could fly into a building and clear the building while a Skydio held security outside. And if somebody jumped out to try and run away, the Skydio would chase them.
Very
and they
cool.
did that. They would do that from one command, which was cover this building.
Wow.
And then they would just go do all of that.
Wow.
Yeah. And it was amazing. It was great. But then I had to retire. So it has since, and then Shield stopped building the Nova. So the program had to shift. And this sort of thing happens.
Sure.
Companies just go into programs and pull out. They succeed. But that's where it was both a blessing and a curse to be in the office I was in, because I was like, did I learn what I needed to learn? Yeah.
Sure.
Did the warfighter get the capability? No. But they got 50 to 60% of what I was originally trying to get them. And that's good enough. And I had to learn that was a huge win, even if I didn't transition exactly what I wanted. But there are plenty of times I had a huge comms program I was doing where we were building man-packable LTE, and it was basically like an LTE node you could put on your back, but it was small enough to where you could cover an entire platoon of people with LTE. And it was a great program. We had 3 years. In the last year, I think there was 50 million left on the program because they're supposed to scale out, and we were almost done. And then between infighting between different organizations and the presidency as to where money needed to go, all of a sudden the money just disappeared. I remember several years ago, I was talking to a warfighter, and they're like, they were just dumbfounded that they would kill a program that was being that effective. And I was like, it's narrative, man. It's just how it goes. If you don't, we can market as hard as we want at the bottom and advocate for a particular thing. But once it gets handed to the next person up, if they're terrible at presenting information, it's just going to die. It's sales.
That is brutal. That is brutal. Let's talk a little bit about your transitions. You said you came into this basically every project with some sort of transition plan or some sort of idea to transition. First of all, what does transition mean to you?
So they talk a lot about valleys of death, but there are multiple valleys of death. There's
Very true.
The main one everybody always talks about is the transition from a functional product to the end user.
Right.
And a program of record
from RDT&E funding to a program of record.
Right. So you should, before you even have a conversation about what you're messing around with, you should have an idea of who that program of record is.
Sure.
Bottom line, you should have an idea of that. Now, that program of record may not know what they're talking about, may not realize the value of it. So then you need to start doing an information campaign to educate them on those things. So we did a lot with SOCOM in particular, but we also worked with different Army soldier-borne systems programs, Net Warrior, big Navy programs. And so we would just identify who that person was going to be at the end state. And then we would look at where they currently are in their POM over the fight up. And so you'd say, all right, over the next 5 years, you're going to spend this amount of money on this. Have you already identified all the programs you're going to be feeding into that? And once you already know where the money is going to be moving relative to those capabilities, then you can say, all right, this falls under you. Here's a gap. And then it was both. So then we had to start the information campaign. And that's where those videos that we would make became very useful, because I could send a link to somebody that was a senior officer in that office and be like, here's a 3-minute video. Just watch it. You don't have to watch. You don't have to. It's not a quad slide. I'm not going to put you to death with the presentation. Just watch this cool video. And they'd watch a video and be like, well, that's incredible. Like, I get it now. And it was significantly more powerful than anything we could have done. And we didn't waste their time. We didn't need to spend hours on it, but they ended up wanting to call us and talk to us for long periods of time to discuss these particular capabilities. And that was really so we were part sales, part technician, and part operator is what we ended up becoming, and that was the value of our office, is that we understood operational employment. But since we were green suiters, we walked in with the experience of having operated in the field with this particular capability. And so that was really where the transition came in. But at any point in time, we could recognize that a different organization could need it. The other thing that we did that became powerful for us is like the example I brought up to you about the AFWorks SIBRs. Because we were coming in with, let's say we were working with, I don't know, a PJ unit or something like that over on the Air Force side. Because we were walking in as a joint service need, the program offices were significantly more willing to listen to us because we were coming, not just Naval Special Warfare, not just AFSOC, but it was a lot of times it'd be all four of us. It'd be USASOC, AFSOC, MARSOC, and SW all walking in and saying, we want this. And then the program officer's happy camper because the job of the acquisition systems manager is not, and this is, might get people mad, but this is the reality. It's not to give warfighter capabilities. It's to execute funding. Their job is to spend money. It's just spend money. Yep. And so if there's a contract vehicle in place, if there is a validated need, and if there is money to expend and the color of money matches the product that they're trying to get to, and it fits within their OT timeline, operational testing timeline, send it. And so we would just make it easy by actually doing all of that for them. And then in certain cases, we would help them write capabilities development documents or ICDs. I would do that with the office down the hall. I'd walk down and be like, hey, you need to be adding GPUs into your systems now and a requirement for them now. And he's like, I don't know what that is. Okay, I'll write it all up for you. And so then I would go pull that information. And then I hand it, be like, okay, this is based on the current chipset requirement. Here's the power. Here's the swap requirements for it to integrate into your system. This is your new threshold, bare minimum. It's not your objective. This is your new threshold. And because I was like, by the time this becomes articulated, it's 3 years from now.
Right.
So now you're dealing with, it's old. So if you can do what the best thing is out there right now in 3 years, you're going to be okay.
Now, you mentioned if there's a contract vehicle in place, and I think oftentimes there is a contract vehicle in place, but it may be with a large prime contractor. It may be with an established contractor. Did you find that you were coming up against those sort of walls or barriers in which you had IP concerns, you had issues with large prime contractors not really wanting to play ball with the small companies or the small groups that were doing the innovation?
Yeah. So most large contractors like primes, most of them use subcontracts and use these smaller vendors anyway. Very few of them are actually building their own technology nowadays.
Okay.
They, if you were to go to like Booz Allen or Lockheed or even Raytheon or CACI, sometimes they'll acquire companies because they're getting a lot of contracts and it's just easier. But a lot of times they'll be like, I have a vehicle here that I could use. We won't touch your IP, but it's a vehicle and we need a win. It was surprising that how easy it was to use a lot of those. Companies would get froggy at first to be like, I don't want this company having any access to my IP because I don't want them to steal it. That's a legal thing that you could articulate your NDA more effectively at the end of the day.
Sure.
And if you don't have a strong understanding of what your IP actually is, then you probably shouldn't be going into that conversation to begin with. And that is another, you saw that a lot where the other thing is the primes make most of their money, not in stealing IP, but in charging overhead.
That's very true.
So if you go into a subcontract with them, they're taking a 50% overhead for management. Right. So $1 million contract, $500,000 is going into the prime to literally do nothing. But it is a model you see again and again. I'm seeing it with OTs as well, where one company will get an OT and what they'll do is they will subcontract other companies under that OT to get access to the government, and then they take a 50% cut.
Interesting.
And then you see that a bit with, it's been interesting watching the way that these ecosystems have broken off. I've got friends who've gone straight into VC, and their whole thing is, we'll get you SIBRs and we'll get you these other things, but we'll take a part of your equity. So that's a big one. I have weird feelings about that because these companies are so small anyway. If you deliver on them, so be it. There's a lot of people that come straight out of the acquisitions world that just all they do is just put your company name on a list of people on their spreadsheet that they just send out to the government and say, I'm having an event, come check out my stuff. And I don't know. A lot of those are charlatans. And some of it does well because it helps people gain traction. But as an independent author, I get played constantly, people reach out to me constantly to play me, to try to get me to give money to them so I can get another review on Amazon. Yeah, I see it's a parallel. They think they're doing a service, but in reality, most of the time, they're just manipulating the situation. Not all of them, some of them. And so this is going to be careful when it comes to hiring certain contractors in the acquisitions world, because especially if they've only worked in government and they have all the DAU certs you could ever imagine. And then they come in and say, I'm going to sell this product for you. All they're doing is identifying palm cycles, identifying when funding is going to fall in, and then call up their buddy to say, hey, would you be willing to buy this thing? Not understanding that their buddy, even on the good side, there are so many pressures at play to what leads to a down select. I could tell the story about this virtual reality system we built where, long story short, is we built this system that at the end it would probably maybe only cost $4,000 or $5,000 to train JTACs to literally sit in their hooch and train on everything they'd be doing for a joint terminal attack control skill development, instead of using these gargantuan $1 million domes that they have throughout the country. And when we presented the program of record, they asked the vendor that they had on contract, hey, can you do something like this? And they said, sure, we can. And the guy goes, all right, we already got it. And in reality, they were lying. And then 6 months later, there was actually an indictment for the CEO of that company and the government official that was a part of it because they were embezzling money. Once again, I'm being just reality of the situation here. It's cutthroat. And then there are individuals that are trying to do everything they can to do it. And this is the same as with politics even. Is the person trying to do the right thing needs to watch their back way more than the person that's not. But once again, we were a campaign of learning and figuring these things out. When we found the appropriate personality and the appropriate center of excellence, we drove in hard. One analogy from a friend of mine at the Office of Naval Research that I take to heart is people fall into one of three categories. They're either a source, a sink, or a catalyst. A source is an individual that gives you any of the resources that you need, and you are just on the receiving end. It's good, but it's one-sided because you're just taking from them.
Right.
A sink is the opposite. It's an individual that sees you as a source and is taking from you the entire time, but they're not offering anything back. But the person you really want to find is a catalyst. And that's an individual that when you find them, they just want to move. And they're willing to support, and they're willing to be alongside you for everything you're trying to do along the way. The only people I ever wanted were catalysts. Sources were nice, but I wanted catalysts because I wanted to move. And so when I found those people, I would latch on really hard and I would just dig in. And there were plenty of people that I've met over the years where they're like, hey, Jim, how come you never called me back? And I was like, I did. And I never heard from you again. And you went into the sink pile. And that's not because I was trying to crush you. I just didn't have time. I had too many people I was chasing. And I can't sit around and try and make things work for you. Also, eventually people that you work with, companies that were doing great stuff, suddenly they'd show back up and they just were like, hey, Jim, we know you're the guy that knows how to make money. Can you help me find money? I'm like, no, it's not what I do. I don't find money so you can have money. My job is to find these emerging technology capabilities and change the fight. Are you helping me change the fight by me putting money in your pocket? No.
Probably not.
I later found out that guy was a Mossad agent, which was even more complicated because...
Ooh, fun.
Lots of fun. So I'm glad I didn't work with that guy because it was just...
I bet.
No.
I bet.
Yeah.
So where was your organization when you left?
So remember I mentioned the fact that a lot of things are personality driven?
Yep.
Between my director, who was a SEAL captain, and we had a GS-15 deputy, and then I was the senior enlisted running. I was running the projects. I was the down and in. They were the up and out.
Sure.
All of us, our PCS time came around at the exact same time.
Oh,
We down selected the appropriate people to follow up on us for us, but what we were doing was too radical. And you have these very competent operators and very smart people in their own right that don't know how to think outside of an institutionalized process. And so the program just died. It's gone now.
That's devastating. That's tragic. DIU though, DIU is still there.
Yeah, it's a
different permutation, but it's still there.
And that is up for debate. Because that may change.
That's very true.
But that is another organization that is personality driven. So, for example, when you're dealing with an individual that knows how to move technology and knows how to articulate problems effectively, they can run those programs really well. But really, DIU's job is to find a program or an organization that wants to fund a particular capability, and then they manage and help them as subject matter experts conduct the OT. And people don't understand that. They go back to DIU saying, how come?
Why aren't you our customer?
Why aren't you creating better stuff? It's a really good example, and I'm not in the military anymore, so I could say this. There was a program they were working on, in the Short Range Reconnaissance Drone Program. And one of the requirements from a particular part of the Army was saying, you have to integrate the TOGA controller.
Sure.
So the TOGA if you were to describe that system, it looks like an Abrams tank and a Nintendo DS had a baby, and you had to strap it to your chest. So it is this gargantuan thing that when they actually had a private flying the drones for more than 40 minutes, the kid had to sit down because his neck was so strained under the weight of the controller. But the Army was like, you have to implement this. And so then when they show the products of that solution back to other people, they were like, yeah, that program's great. That controller is garbage.
Sure.
DIU sucks.
Because they were the one that insisted upon it.
No, they were not the one that did it. It was the Army insisted on it. DIU had no part in the down select of that. They just executed what the customer wanted.
They just had to do what the customer wanted, not what they
needed.
The
customer wanted that. So they were like, okay, if we're going to force people onto the toga. And it was bad for companies like Skydio because they were like, we don't want people or drone being associated with that controller. So eventually they pulled away from it. They got wise to it. But it was one individual saying, no, under no circumstance, I'm trying to save the government money and have only one controller for all types of drones. But he was not a ground operator in any way. So he wasn't the person who was going to have to carry this stuff. So that ultimately is the part about in the acquisitions process that is so critical, is understanding the difference between man packable and man portable. And unless huge difference, 30 and 80 pounds, right?
Yeah.
But as an individual that carried more than 100 pounds on my back, what I was carrying was considered man portable, but it was man packable. If I had actually the things that I needed, I would want things down to about 10, 15 pounds at most. I wouldn't want something that accumulated to being well over that, because that's eventually why you have back problems. But that individual was saying, if I'm flying a Group 3 UAS and I'm flying a Group 1 UAS, I want to have the same controller. And that doesn't make any sense. Those are other examples. But the narrative that comes out of that, nobody has time to sit there and learn all the nuances of what I just explained to you. Instead, It just turns into DIU sucks.
And we're not speaking on behalf of the government here, so we can say that. What did you decide to do after you left?
So I got out and consulted for a while with private companies, and eventually I actually worked as the PM for AeroVironment for a year on what was called managing a computer vision team, doing loitering munitions and automatic target recognition. Currently, though, I work as an author and consultant and private contractor, and I write fiction. I write techno-thrillers based on some of the work that I did while I was in the military.
Fantastic. What are the titles of those so folks can go out and find them?
Yeah. So I have 2 books. The first book is called The Hawk Enigma, and the second is called The Spear and the Sentinel. And it was loosely based off the work I did when I was in the innovation directorate. The individual in there, he works for something called the directorate, and he does R&D and builds out advanced technologies. But it predominantly explores, imagine Q from James Bond, but he does combat operations, right? And then he also, as with that, he carries a bit of weight from different trauma that he's incurred. But he hides it by burying himself in his work. And until one night in his dreams, he starts hearing these strange voices telling him about the future, and he's convinced he's losing his mind. And the next day, one of his buddies calls him up and tells him that there's a task force being put together because these American scientists have gone missing who are working on something called the God algorithm, which is a form of AI. And he suddenly may or may not learn that his dreams and reality might have something to do with each other.
That sounds like the next book on my reading list. That is absolutely amazing. I love that. That's fantastic. How are you still supporting the DoD innovation environment?
A couple ways. I still contract for the government. I work for the Pentagon as well as for SOCOM. I also help with these things called Innovation Foundry events at SOCOM. I've run, I think, 10 Innovation Foundries as the tech director at this point.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, we recently have done some in the United Kingdom as well as Norway, but most of them are based out of Tampa, and that's where I help write the scenarios that the people participating in the events, and then I direct the facilitators that run the events. And then we help create the products for that with a team of other people, one of whom is a former Hollywood producer. We have some video direction individuals, cinema directors who actually film things and make videos off of these, as well as some technical writers. And so we have a small team that does that. Those are one-offs. They don't happen very often. They're like 2 or 3 a year at most. And so I do those as an aside in addition to the other contracting work that I do.
Very cool. Very cool. Do you work with small companies? Can they reach out to you to pick your brain, to ask you questions, to potentially get in contact with soft operators?
Yeah, I'm always willing to talk to somebody about whatever it is that they're going with. I will say this, though, that I'm pretty picky. I gained a reputation for being brutally honest. When people would say, hey, I've got this idea, and I'd be like, hey, here's how that's going to suck. But a lot of times people tend to thank me because they're like, nobody gives
honest feedback anymore.
At the same time, it's not that I'm not trying to be cruel. It's just to be like, look, here are the hurdles you have if you're not aware.
Sure.
And here's how to overcome those hurdles. And I'll talk to anybody for a few minutes. Anything beyond 30 minutes, you got to put me on a retainer. But, and right beyond that, but to be honest though, I don't do a whole lot of that because I just have so much on my plate right now.
Sure. Will you be at Soft Week this year?
This year I won't. Unfortunately, I have a major exercise that I'll be involved in on the West Coast, so I won't be at Soft Week. I was last year. Normally I would be over at the S&T booth. Is where you could come find me. Maybe next year, not this year.
How else can people get a hold of you? If they want to follow you, if they want to get a hold of you to have that 30-minute or less conversation, how can they reach you?
So the easiest way to get a hold of me is through my website, jlhancock.com. I have all my social media at the bottom, or you can just click on whether it be Instagram or Facebook or whatever. But the easiest thing is just go to that website and send me an email. I answer them. I check it basically every day.
Fantastic. And what kind of tools, technologies, systems are you on the hunt for these days?
Right now, the name of the game right now is over the horizon targeting. Everything is about closing kill chains as fast as possible. No, I wouldn't say humanly possible, as fast as digitally possible. Everything is about that right now. And so all the technologies that I'm looking at are how do you mitigate the need for human interaction?
Interesting. So taking the man, the person, the woman out of the loop.
So making them make the decisions so they can manage other resources, as opposed to what we refer to as swivel chair operations. One person having to swap between systems. Like that is a degraded form of interacting with things.
Absolutely.
And so that's what the main focus, I would say, that and loitering munitions are. I mean, small UAS that can defeat any jamming in EW.
Very cool. This is fantastic. I'm absolutely going to have you back on the show because we could talk for hours and hours about this stuff. I just go nuts for it. So I really appreciate you hopping on the call today. This has been a fantastic conversation, and I'd love to dive in a little bit deeper the next time I have you on the show.
Sounds great.
Awesome. Thank you so much, JL. It's been great.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to this episode of GovCon Unscripted with your host, Chelsea Meggett. Do you have a GovCon story or need guidance in government contracting? Connect with Chelsea on LinkedIn to be a guest on the show or to enhance your business strategy. Don't forget, your network is your net worth. If you liked what you heard, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with your growing GovCon community.